So, as of June 24th, 2021, so 2 days ago, I am officially a U.S. citizen. Um, I have been waiting for this day for so long, and I know that there are people out there like me who were probably really, really nervous about their upcoming um, naturalization or citizenship interview. So I wanted to kind of talk about what that was like for me, and I know this doesn't have much to do with mental health and what I've been doing in my previous videos, but it's a really, really big life event for me. So obviously I want to document it and talk about it a little bit. Okay, so a little bit of additional background information about me. I was born in Sinaloa, Mexico, and I was born with cerebral palsy, spastic diplegic cerebral palsy. I was a premature baby, and as an adult, I was also diagnosed with inattentive ADHD. Symptoms were always there, but I just didn't get an official diagnosis until I was an adult because as a child, doctors and other adults around me were mostly focused on treating the physical symptoms of CP and not any additional problems that I might have had at the time. But anyway, at about the age of 2, my parents noticed that I still wasn't walking. There was something wrong with me physically. They took me to the doctor. Doctors in Mexico diagnosed me with CP or cerebral palsy, and they pretty much told my parents that there was no way that I would be able to walk or live a life independently or go to normal schooling or any of that. They didn't really give my parents much hope for me at all. And in a desperate attempt to cling on to hope, my parents migrated to the United States in search of better treatment for my cerebral palsy. And so they came over here on October 12th of 1992. I was 2 years old at the time. And then about a year later, with the help of a lot of physical therapy and a walker and an AFO, I was eventually able to take my first steps at the age of 3. And eventually I learned to walk independently, although cerebral palsy still does affect me, and I walk with a limp, and there are some things that I still struggle to do. So that's a little bit of a background story about me. And so I was raised here, but I was undocumented. I originally became a permanent resident, so I got my green card through marriage 5 years ago. I married my high school sweetheart, um, and we had one son together. And unfortunately, he had an affair with a coworker, and this is getting a little personal, but point being, we just couldn't work things out after that. So we separated, but we actually get along a lot better now than we ever really did when we were together, because before we even were together, we were best friends. So now it's almost like we've gone back to that point where we're just friends, but we're also co-parenting, because we have a 7-year-old son. So, but yeah, we've been separated for a couple of years now. We initiated the divorce, but it never got finalized because we never got around to it. But that's just kind of a little bit of a background story of where I was when I walked into that U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Office for my naturalization interview. So I waited outside in line, and my son's dad actually was there with me for moral support. And we got to the lobby after we went through the metal detectors. We got to the lobby, and my attorney was there waiting for us. And then I sat there, and my attorney kind of started quizzing me. He asked me if I had studied for the Civics test. For those of you who don't know, when you go into an interview for naturalization or citizenship, you do have to pass a civics and history test. There's a total of 100 questions that I had to study. They really only ask you 10, and you only have to get 6 out of those 10 questions correct. But of course, you don't know what questions exactly you're going to ask. They're going to ask, so you have to study all 100 questions, which is what I did. And I studied through this YouTube video, which was really, really helpful for me. I will leave the link for it down below for anyone looking for study resources for their interview. And aside from the civics test, they also go over your entire application. Basic details: name, date of birth, address, if you've traveled outside the U.S., have you ever been part of a terrorist group, have you ever committed mass genocide, have you ever, there's like a bunch of kind of ridiculous questions, but I mean, I guess I understand why they would want to know all that. And they ask you if you've ever been deported or placed in deportation proceedings, and that's kind of where it got a little messy for me, because when I first filed for my green card around 2012, I made the mistake of following the advice of a corrupt and unethical attorney who advised that I file for asylum, because he said that was really the only way for me to obtain status here in the U.S. And that got me in a huge mess. I spent thousands of dollars for legal advice and to meet with this attorney who ended up just putting me in deportation proceedings. And I was so close to being deported. And at the time when I stood in front of an immigration judge, I was like 2 or 3 months pregnant with my son, and it was absolutely terrifying. So I have to say, if you're seeking legal advice, please do your due diligence and do your research. And I fired that attorney and hired a new one. The law offices of Art Bracken and Associates are the new attorney. That's the new attorney that I hired, and he's the one that was able to get me out of deportation, and he got me out of that mess and helped me obtain my green card and eventually my citizenship. So if you're looking for legal advice and you're in Southern California, I highly recommend law offices of Richard Bracken in Rialto. This is not like a sponsored ad or anything. I'm just really grateful for everything they've done for me and being able to get me out of that mess. Anyway, so I walked into the lobby and my attorney started quizzing me on the civics questions, just to kind of make sure that I was prepared. When was the Constitution written? When was it adopted? How many members do we have in the House of Representatives? What does the judicial branch do? There's just a bunch of different history and geography and civics questions that we have to study for. And we waited outside in the lobby for maybe 10 minutes, and then I was called in. And like I said, that's what I was worried about, the fact that I was placed in deportation proceedings because I filed for asylum, which is back in like 2013, which is something that apparently I should not have done, but I did because I was following my previous attorney's legal advice blindly. So I was freaking out about that because I know that they were eventually going to ask me, have I ever been placed in deportation proceedings? And the fact of the matter was that I had. And even though that case was the proceedings were terminated and I eventually ended up getting my green card anyway, it's still a sticky situation because I guess what that attorney had me do, the previous attorney had me do, is considered some sort of fraud. So that really could have put my citizenship in jeopardy. So I was freaking out about, what I was going to say when they asked me that question. Because if I admitted to signing that paperwork, then technically, I guess in a way, I would be having been admitted to doing fraud. But then my current attorney kind of reassured me that it really wasn't my fault because I wasn't entirely aware of what was going on. I was just following legal advice. I was following legal counsel, and that's the truth, is I was just kind of blindly following that attorney's advice, and it really was not my fault. But I was still kind of freaking out about it. And for those who don't know, I do have major anxiety. And this was a kind of a really important thing for me, obviously. So when I was called in, uh, I was called in and I followed the immigration officer through a corridor and into a room where eventually she had me raise my right hand and swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. And she asked me for my first and last name. And then she told me that she was going to go to the room next door and that the rest of the interview was going to be conducted via a screen. So there was an iPad sitting next to me, which was kind of weird, but I guess they're still taking COVID precautions. And so that's what happened. She went to the room next door. The screen next to me turned on. She asked me if I could see or hear her. And I said that yes, I could. And she went over the application, asked me for my first and last name, address, and all that. And then she noticed that when it got to my address and my husband's address, because we're still legally married, because like I said, the divorce, we haven't finalized yet. If it's finalized yet. So she noticed that we had different addresses, and I said, yeah, we're living separately. And she kind of dug into that more. She said, is it because he works further away, or is it more because of personal issues? And I said, exactly, it's personal issues. And she didn't pry into that any more than any further than that, which was kind of a relief to me because I knew that I had initially obtained my green card through marriage. So that was one of the things that worried me, that the fact that we were now separated and technically not together, would that then affect my eligibility to become a citizen? But then my attorney assured me that, well, about half of the marriages in the U.S. end in divorce, and that it shouldn't really affect my eligibility because my marriage was legitimate. We have a son, we were married for a couple years, and despite our best efforts, we just couldn't make things work after his affair. Anyway, so she asked me about that, about why we were living separately. I answered. She went on to the next question, the next couple of questions in my application. Like if I had taken any trips outside of the U.S. and for how long. And then she got to that dreaded question about had I ever been placed in deportation proceedings. And I froze. I froze because I had flashbacks to the day where I had to stand in front of that judge, and my fate and my son's fate, who was whom I was 3 months pregnant with at the time, was decided by that judge. Like, was she going to be able to let me stay in the U.S., or was I going to end up being deported and having to give birth to my son in Mexico, and despite having been in the U.S. since the age of 2. And so she, the immigration officer, when I was during my naturalization interview, asked me if I had been in deportation proceedings, and I said yes. And she said, why? And I said, well, I sought counsel from an attorney who ended up getting me into a big mess, and I ended up in deportation proceedings. And I was hoping that she wouldn't ask anything more than that. But she, I guess, had my application and my file. She must have had my entire file right in front of her, because she said, okay, but what do you remember what you signed that got you into deportation proceedings? Was it because of asylum? And I was kind of in shock because I wasn't expecting her to kind of know that or to go into details. And I said, yeah, I think so. And then my attorney, who was right behind me the entire time, he was in the room with me and sitting behind me. He jumped in. He said, yeah, I think that's what happened. But we were able to get the proceedings terminated because her husband is a veteran. He was in the military, and she was granted parole in place so that she could stay in the U.S. while she obtained status, or another way, obtain my green card. And luckily for me, the officer didn't ask anything more of that because that is what happened. And then she moved on to the civics exam, and I actually have the questions that she asked me right here. She asked, um, what is the supreme law of the land, which is the Constitution. She asked, what is an amendment, a change to the Constitution? We elect a president for how many years? And, 4 years. The House of Representatives has how many voting members? And I believe that's 435. Um, yeah, I think so. And then who is the Speaker of the House now? Nancy Pelosi. And what are two rights of everyone living in the United States? And I said freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So I got the first 6 questions correct, which gave me a passing score, and she didn't have to ask any more of the civics exam questions. But the way that it works is that if you don't get the first 6 correct, she will keep asking, and I think she will ask. She'll ask up to like 10 questions, and you just have to get 6 of them right. And a lot of them, like the ones that she asked me, are common sense, but there are some more complicated ones out there. I just got lucky. I guess I got some of the easier ones. After the civics exam, she went over some more stuff on my application. She asked me if I wanted to change my name, and I said yes, because I wanted to change my last name back to my maiden name, because I will be getting my bachelor's degree next spring, and I kind of want to have my maiden last name on my degree as a way to honor my parents. And she said, okay. She changed my last name. She said, follow me to the next room. She took a picture of me and approved my application on the spot. And then she told me I could go to the oath ceremony right away, which was taking place downstairs. And I went downstairs. I signed some paperwork. I handed the clerk my green card because I was no longer going to need it since I was officially now a naturalized U.S. citizen. So you do have to give them your green card back. And I waited in the lobby for the oath ceremony, and that took forever. I literally waited there for like 2 hours. And then they gave me a little American flag and had me say the oath as I raised my right hand, and that was that. And my attorney was there with me the entire time. And my son's dad also went with me, but my son's dad actually was not allowed in the interview room with me, which is, I don't know if he wasn't allowed or if my attorney just told him to stay behind. I'm not really sure which of the two it is, but in the actual interview room, it was just my attorney and I and the immigration officer. Though I suspect or I assume that if you're still married and you're going in for an N400 interview, um, that you probably should take your spouse with you, but I guess it's not really required. The interview itself lasted maybe 15 minutes, probably less, but it was very anxiety provoking because there was a lot writing on it. There was a lot on the line. I have lived in the U.S. since the age of 2. I grew up here. I am going to college. I have goals and dreams to become a speech language pathologist or a speech therapist. My life is here, and this is the only, I'm of course proud of my heritage, my background, and my culture, but my life and my home is here, and this is the only place I call home. So going in for an interview is, of course, a naturalization interview is anxiety provoking, to say the least. But I think it really helped that my attorney seemed to know most of the officers there, and particularly that officer and he seemed to be on friendly terms. And that I don't think that it made like a huge difference in her approving my actual application, but it definitely lightened the mood a bit, and it wasn't like as scary or intimidating as it could have been. Anyway, so that was my experience with my N400 interview, my naturalization interview, or my interview to become a U.S. citizen. Um, I passed and my citizenship was approved and I got my certificate, and that was that. But this was like an 8-year journey that I had to go through with my attorney, from them getting me, starting with them getting me out of the deportation proceedings and out of that mess that my previous attorney put me into, and then eventually asking for parole in place, which is a special military provision for family members uh, of military personnel who are trying to obtain status in the U.S. And thanks to parole in place, I didn't have to leave the country to get my green card. And so a lot of the times, especially with marriage-based marriage-based green cards, or the non-citizen spouse often has to leave the country and go back to uh, their country of citizenship and wait for the application and the whole process to be done while they wait outside of the U.S. And I think if it wasn't for parole in place and if it wasn't for me finding this attorney, then that probably would have happened to me. But thankfully, it didn't. So, like I said, it's very important that you seek, uh, that you do your due diligence when you seek legal advice of any kind, especially with immigration, because immigration matters tend to be can be very complex. So, yeah, let me know down below if you have any questions or comments. And I guess I will be back next week.